Well, thank you very much for these four extremely interesting reports. Luis Fresco suggested that a moderator was missing in this roundtable. To tell you the true truth, it was voluntary, sorry. I wanted to make a test of governance. You know, if you have a session without a moderator, something is getting wrong. And I realized that Louise was totally at loss. You know, she was lost. So I wanted to repair. But you see, that's interesting because even if a small group like this needs some minimum governance, but I am half serious. It is some minimum, you know, governance rules. What about these complex systems we have been discussing in the last 3 days? So thank you very much. You know, these workshops are really an extremely important part of a conference, an undertaking like this, and I think in the future we should deepen also this part of our activities. So thank you very much. I think the four reports and presentations were outstanding. Now we have roughly 10 minutes before us, and since the topics of these four workshops are interacting a lot, you know, they are all linked in a deep way, I would like to ask each of you if you have comments or questions perhaps, but probably more comments on the other reports. So perhaps we could start in the initial order. So please, well, each of you can take 3 minutes, for instance, to make some general comments on what the others have said, and I will start with Bill. I take him by surprise, of course. Another example of the governance issue.
To have completed your experiment on governance, you might have stayed in the audience to watch what form of governments emerged amongst the four of us up here. A little trial and error to see what might work. It's not too hard to comment on the rest of the panel's presentations because each of them applies in the energy sector. You hear about energy and health, you hear about energy and food scarcity, you hear about energy and governance. Energy has all of those problems, none of which has been resolved, all of which are under study, all of which are changing, shifting. The dimensions change a great deal. Energy didn't think a lot about food security until we decided to get into alternative fuels for transportation, because transportation is where we are most vulnerable to imported oil. Everybody thinks, how do we change that? Well, let's get to biofuels. We'll grow the fuels at home. Where are we going to grow them? Well, where we already grow things. And so you find grains and other things displaced. You find pressure on prices. You find pressure on grains generally. It transfers to rice and transfers around the world. These are things we didn't think about, the unintended consequences of how the energy sector operates. Obviously, if the energy sector is dysfunctional and energy becomes too expensive, you find things like deforestation being accelerated because people who used to use LPG, that used to get out into populations for cook stoves and things like that, can no longer afford the cook stoves, and so you get deforestation happening around the peripheries of cities that are nearby forests. I watched this in Congo when I was ambassador there. With aerial surveillance, you could actually see the deforestation progressing out of the cities as civil war in the city forbid access to LPG. Health issues immediately emerge if you haven't got the kinds of energy you need for heating, for cooking, for boiling water. It's all tied together. And as to the institutions, indeed, our institutions are old and they are trying to adopt, they're trying to shift. It was remarked down the way that the IEA is obsolete. Maybe obsolete, or maybe it came out of a different set of circumstances. For instance, the oil embargo in 1973-4, that period. But it's a different world now, and there's reason to adapt the organizations we have instead of going out and creating yet other ones. A proliferation of organizations is not an answer. That's a bureaucratic response to a substantive issue. It doesn't advance you, it complicates the dialogue. So let's see how we can maximize the use of the institutions we have. If outreach is not sufficient, go a step further. But if outreach and substantive engagement can get you there, take the first steps, and I pass the baton.
Thank you very much for your extremely well-prepared second intervention. And now I give the floor to Louise.
It seems to me that the underlying issue in our 4 working groups and also in the debates we've had this time, and in fact earlier years as well, is the issue of global governance. The reaction of the world has been that every time we see a problem, we create an institution and a handful of treaties. And that leads to those 158,000 treaties and instruments. Obviously, that's not the way forward anymore. And this raises a fundamental issue of the reform, I believe, of the UN system. It's clear that we need something like the UN, where countries are represented, whether that's a one country, one vote basis or some other basis. But I think the real challenge for the future will be to redesign the UN system. Now, we're indeed stuck in the discussions around the Security Council. I would tend to think that we need to leave that run its course, as this is a very complex issue, but look instead at the part of the UN that we normally don't look at, and that is the proliferation of other agencies, whether it's in the areas of health and environment and food and water, what have you. Just to give you one of my favorite statistics in this one, in the UN there are 29 agencies that have water as a prime priority in their strategic plans. I don't want you to even imagine the transaction costs of that. I think the current problems cannot be dealt with anymore by sectoral organizations, having one UNESCO for education, ILO for labor, FAO for food and agriculture. We obviously need to clean this up. This is not going to be easy because these agencies all have their own constitutions, etc., etc. However, to recreate a number of hands-on organizations that actually act as platforms to help to share experiences in different sectors that are cross-sectoral, such as energy, such as food, such as health, I think would be a great advantage. On the positive side, we must admit that while countries have been stalling and have been very slow, the UN system in the first place, of course, a lot of innovation has come from civil society. I think in the area of climate, for example, the private sector is moving much faster and much more efficiency than most governments. Similarly, the NGOs and the use of social media make that a lot of awareness is now being created on various issues. We need to find a way, which is also a governmental way, because we need some form of governance, that incorporates these initiatives and gives us a very lean organization to come with a few basic treaties that make sure that we create a level playing field, both for the private sector and for countries to work in. And if I may suggest, Mr. Chairman, I think that would be one of the great challenges for us also in this kind of policy forum to discuss one day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Jérôme?
I can be quick because already a lot has been said, in particular by Louise. I think that, I mean, what strikes me from these 4 groups is that on one hand, a lot of initiatives taken by the civil society, as you mentioned, whether it's NGOs or private operators or private companies, let's say, who tend to have a global view today of where the world stands, has helped, you know, to make things moving progressively. On the other hand, the main institutions which were created after the Second World War obviously are outdated. I think we all share that. And we see that in many areas when things had to progress, I mean, they have been overcome in a way or another by other type of governing structure. But I think that what is striking as well, and here there might be some frustration, is that what we are lacking is clearly a leadership of global governance. And we could have thought, or we can still think, that the G20 could be one of these new governing bodies of the world to tackle the multilateral issues that we are facing in a global, a very interdependent world. And it's fair to say, along with what my neighbor here said from his group, is that the G20 so far has been more focusing on short-term crises and more the medium to long-term vision, which should bring the leadership and the vision for the decades to come. So there are elements there which, I mean, appeal for more leadership and for more from actions towards a complete overhaul, let's say, of the existing institutions which are leading the world, which very much are still relying upon things which were created some 50 years ago.
Thank you very much, Stuart.
Yes, just some brief comments. The first, just picking up on the last statement about the G20 and its role, all three of these areas are ones that I think lend themselves to G20 involvement. To some degree, there already has been some G20 involvement in, for instance, fossil fuel subsidies issues, food security, to some degree a focus of the French presidency. Health would seem to be a natural one for the G20 to in the near future get more involved in. There is always a question about the degree to which the G20 or the G8 before it should, in a sense, stick to its knitting and have a narrow focus, as Lourdes Aranda suggested yesterday. But it's inevitable that when leaders get together, they will discuss whatever they like, regardless of what's on the formal agenda. And I would expect a certain amount of mission creep in that regard. Another point that comes out across the three of these is the indispensable role and growing role of the private sector in global governance and in public-private partnerships. This is certainly the case when we talk about climate or energy in realms such as emissions trading, technology, financing, et cetera. But it's also true in global health, obviously in the role of vaccines, advanced market commitment for vaccines, and other sorts of arrangements. Just a couple of other comments. Specifically with respect to global food security, the presentation mentioned a number of different things that could be done, including to deal with perhaps the volatility in commodities, greater investments in agricultural productivity, et cetera. One thing that we don't like to think about, but was emphasized in a recent Nature article, was the fact that there may have to be limits to the sort of consumption that we have, particularly our consumption of meat. It's extraordinary when you think about agricultural land. More than half of agricultural land, I believe, is devoted either to the production of livestock or to the production of feed for livestock. And as demographic pressures and lifestyles change in the developing world, we're going to see greater and greater pressure on agricultural land. Final point, just on global health, is that there are a number of issues that are brought up in this area, which one could also see in different areas. One of them is agenda setting. Who actually sets the agenda? So often it's been the wealthy donor countries as opposed to the developing countries. And you've obviously seen a shift, and sometimes shifts on the basis of fads. And most recently, obviously, the focus on non-communicable diseases as opposed to infectious diseases. With respect to coordination, I think that my sense is that the WHO is still trying to find a coordinating role in an incredibly crowded field. It's created something called the H8 or the Health 8 to try to address this problem, but again, testifies to the lack of coherence that I think was described from that breakout session. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very